Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm talking to computer science professor Dr. Jeremy Straub about the effects of AI on student preparedness for university and the workplace. So join us as we explore AI developments since the millennium, the impacts of AI on educational systems, and then the implications for the future as AI continues to evolve. So welcome to the Sunday Late Show. Today you find me on the final evening of the shortest half-term holiday of the year and on the eve of my A-level English literature students' final exam, Elements of Crime Writing, which they are due to sit tomorrow morning. Since we last spoke, my IGCSE English students have completed their language and literature papers and are now busy revising for the science examinations that stand between them and the longest summer holiday of their school careers. So far, it's been a relatively calm examination season. Our students happily found themselves tested in the exam room on key content from the literature text that they had covered thoroughly and revisited recently, while the language exams should have held no terrors for those comfortable with the format of a formal letter and the willingness to put into practice all of the descriptive strategies we've been working on over the last few weeks. In preparing for the descriptive writing task, which counts for 25% of a student's final language grade on our syllabus, and can be as notoriously open-ended as describe the view from a window at dusk, I have sat alongside 3 different sets of Year 11 students describing the likes of an abandoned shoe, a discarded toy, a crisp packet from the 1980s, a derelict industrial machine, and a mysterious document recovered from a green bottle in a variety of 7-minute writing sprints. Similarly, I have penned descriptions of public speakers, lost children, street magicians, buskers, and museum tour guides in various lessons since April, all of which proving that it is eminently possible to write 6 paragraphs of between 5 and 7 sentences in about 49 minutes and still give yourselves 5 minutes to sketch out a plan and 5 minutes to proofread the resulting description. As students got closer to the exam, I was particularly pleased to observe that the writing became considerably less formulaic, particularly among higher set students who began to see the various structural guidelines and technique lists upon which we had trained them as offering the broad outlines of what good descriptive writing might look like, rather than a writing by numbers route march through 3 sides of A4. In the course of our lessons, we fed similar instructions to various AI models and were heartened to see that the most arresting metaphors and similes were still coming from the nibs of the human writers in the room rather than from the blinking cursor of the general purpose LLM in the corner. One thing the LLM was particularly weak at was drawing its figurative devices from the same thematic or semantic fields. So in describing the mood and atmosphere in a museum as a primary school party arrives to see the dinosaur exhibition, it would occasionally draw its metaphors from the domains of paleontology and archaeology before either repeating itself or lapsing into some wholly unrelated domain only a few phrases later. Its products then invariably felt flat, uncrafted, or unexceptional. They certainly struggled to exhibit the flair that is the essential performance criterion of the highest attainment band on a Cambridge International First Language English composition task. Against the backdrop of complaints that literary agents have been airing online over the last few months about being sent AI-composed novels for review and comment, I hope 11EN2 at least have seen at first hand that no one gets too excited about the lengthy fictional products of an algorithm that has still to master the art of presenting the best words in the best order, or of presenting precise observations of objects freighted with intriguing backstories, veiled in the psychic residues of the instant of their creation, or of straying from the brief in such a way that the brief itself is diminished by the grandeur of post-prompted product. This month, sixth forms and colleges across the country have been submitting NEA work in subjects like English literature, geography, and history to exam boards for final assessment. Developments in AI over the past 12 months, of course, have caused JCQ to rewrite their regulations on centre authentication of student work, which in turn has prompted exam centres to develop new policies on AI use, monitoring, and authentication of student research and writing in extended essay subjects. I expect that many senior leaders have had that conversation with the student about the genuineness of their written work by now, a conversation that is never comfortable and is certainly very painful indeed, where the student has submitted something essentially unauthenticatable within days of the exam board's submission deadline. From all the examination documents I have seen to date, however, it still remains unclear to me what happens once a teacher decides they are unable to authenticate a student's work as their own unaided effort, despite the student having signed a declaration form affirming that it is. Who then decides whether the work is admissible for submission or not? It is questions like these that suggest that the independent research project as it currently exists is entering the twilight of its years. Were it to be axed, though, in favour of more pen and paper exams, as some have suggested, how and where would students making the transition from arts and humanities subjects at secondary level to higher education level and to the workplace cultivate the research and project management skills that their forebears honed through hard work, long-form reading and note-taking, and the increasingly skillful navigation of physical and virtual libraries? If the day-to-day business of the real-world workplace is as divorced from the exam hall timed test as we are so frequently told, then what opportunities for the demonstration of initiative and intellectual curiosity would we be curtailing by returning to assessment by traditional examination? On tonight's show, we will be looking closely at some of the challenges posed by the proliferation of AI tools in educational establishments in the UK and America, under the title of Educational AI, Tool or Tyrant. This conversation, of course, comes only a week after the publication of Pope Leo XIV's encyclical Magnifica Humanitas, which argues that, quote, in recent years, it has become increasingly evident how rapidly and profoundly digitalization, artificial intelligence, and robotics are transforming our world. He then goes on to say that technology should not be considered in itself as a force antagonistic to humanity. On the contrary, it has formed part of our history since the beginning as a profoundly human reality linked to the autonomy and freedom of man. So we will take a detailed look at how students might be affected by AI as they seek to make the transition from school to university environments, then subsequently into the workplace. We'll be considering how the development of AI brought us to this present moment and reflecting upon just how ubiquitous AI tools have become in our daily lives. We'll consider how and why our understanding of what education is and what it is for might need to change in the light of developments in AI for teaching and learning. And we will speculate on what might just be over the horizon in the field of educational AI and how institutions and educational professionals might best prepare for it. And I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Dr. Jeremy Straub, a university educator and cybersecurity analyst who has witnessed many of these developments at close quarters throughout his career in industry and higher education. Dr. Jeremy Straub is an associate professor at the University of West Florida Center for Cybersecurity and AI. He holds first degrees in business and IT, two master's degrees in business administration and computer systems and software design, and a PhD in scientific computing. He has previously been awarded over $7 million in grant and contract funding for projects supported by agencies including the US Department of Defense, NASA, and the National Security Agency. His work has also appeared in national news outlets including CNN, Forbes, USA Today, CBS, Newsweek, Fox News, and The Hill. And I'm pleased to say that Jeremy joins us on the line now. Good evening, Jeremy, and thank you for joining us on Teachers Talk Radio tonight.
Glad to be here. Looking forward to a great discussion.
As we start thinking about the role of AI in the educational sphere then, Jeremy, I wonder if it would be helpful if we gave some consideration as to what we might mean by AI and how it has developed since the millennium. So in outline, Jeremy, how did we get to where we find ourselves now?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think one of the challenges for a lot of people is that, they've only really become aware of AI just in the last few years. Maybe they had heard about it a little bit in science fiction. They'd watched maybe a movie that had some element of the technology in it in a fictionalized way. But a lot of people don't realize that the journey here actually is quite a long one, going back, nearly 100 years now, maybe even a little bit longer, depending on exactly where you say, we want to consider the start point of this. Certainly there's work, a while back related to understanding the human brain that has been foundational to things like neural networks, which are one of the key AI technologies that underlie things like large language models, which I think everybody is gaining quite a lot of familiarity with. But along the way, from those kind of early theoretical studies to initial developments such as using rule fact expert systems for helping doctors diagnose diseases and kind of giving them more breadth and depth than they might be able to remember themselves, and helping them can identify things that may not be things that they see every day. Again, we've taken a lot of different steps forward here, and one of the things that is, I think, very telling is that we finally get to the point where the Turing test, quote unquote, was passed. And this is a famous test. Turing was a famous mathematician and pioneer in computer science, and had this idea that basically that the technology had arrived or would arrive when a human was connected to an AI in a way that they wouldn't be able to tell, I'm looking at a computer, so I know it's a computer type thing. And if they couldn't tell whether they were talking to a computer or another human in an environment where it wasn't, otherwise obvious from the environment, that would be kind of the definition of arrival. And that's very much what we saw when the large language models got to the point where they started, again, they're not going to walk down the street because they're a piece of software, but, they started being able to interact and answer questions and make suggestions. And again, just feeling like you were talking to a human. So again, it's been a long road. And certainly large language models are not a solution to everything. I think that's one of the things that we're beginning to see in some of the things you mentioned in the intro about, how they have limitations in certain areas. Are still things that maybe will be overcome by a completely different technology. But certainly LLMs and AI didn't just start like 3 years ago or 4 years ago when the public consciousness started to be aware of them. So that's a really great place to start off.
Yeah, interesting. Now, I was watching an episode of The X-Files last night, actually, from series 1, in which, rather helpfully, Scully happens to date an entry to 1993, and the whole basis of the episode was that this particularly ambitious-minded computer science individual working for a multinational company had managed to program a computer to monitor the entire office building and essentially bump off his boss. And they were talking about the problems of intelligent machines in that very episode in 1993. So it must have been shot sometime before 1993. Were we moving in that direction in the 90s?
Well, I think there was a lot of interest in using technologies in moving towards a lot of the things that we're seeing now. Certainly, they were very different technologies, and the way that people kind of envisioned the technology is getting to a point that's kind of like where we are now, I think may have been a little bit different at that point. There have always been different, a few different kind of viewpoints towards how do we advance AI. And even now, there are still several, with some people saying, we'll keep trying to make the large language models more advanced. We'll keep building capabilities into them. And other people saying, well, we've kind of hit the limit of the large language model, and now we need to, maybe it's a very good interface. We need to augment it with other technologies to be able to make sure that it always makes rational decisions, that it knows where it's getting facts from, and those types of challenges that we hear a lot about with large language models. And so I think going back to the back to the 90s, there were certainly people working in this area. There were people that were doing work that, became the foundation of where we are now, but not all of it, went in the direction that ended up being the one that's currently successful. But, again, like so many other things, something that was an abandoned line of work, or a line of work where somebody is still kind of toiling away and not getting the same notoriety for it right now, may become the next big technology in the future, particularly if it's something that melds well with the interface capability that large language models provide. And certainly large language models solve a number of kind of interesting technical problems in terms of how do you interact with the computer. And ironically, one of the things that is kind of the kind of humorous thing about large language models is the fact that they can't do math without help, right? I mean, they learn patterns of text, which does not, lend itself very well to actually saying, well, what is 2 + 2? Because what is 2 + 2 looks a lot, from a language perspective, like what is 2 + 3, or what is 2 + 4, or what is 2 + 5. And if you don't realize that, there are two critical pieces of information in there, the two numbers and then the symbol that you're putting between them, and then decipher it that way, you can end up with something where, well, these all look about the same. And so, 15 seems like a good answer. We're seeing a lot. So we put that there. And of course, computers historically have been really great at math. So being able to use an LLM to translate something into a format that another type of computer program can process in a way that doesn't have some of the issues LLMs do may very well be our next step forward. And I mean, we're already seeing in some of the large language models that they're commercially hosted ones, that they're beginning to build in these other capabilities to solve for these kind of previously solved issues where the LLM wasn't good at it, but computers were. So certainly lots of stuff going on in the 90s when that X-Files episode you watched, was conceived. Certainly a lot of people kind of thinking forward to both in terms of, what would we like to see, what types of challenges could these technologies solve? And then also, how do we get there, and making, the incremental and sometimes more than incremental steps that got us kind of from there to where we are today.
If we think about the ubiquity, particularly of large language models, though, Jeremy, are there any particular ethical challenges with the general user not really understanding the architecture of how these things work very well?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And I think, the user needs to understand what the limitations of the system are, maybe not entirely what the architecture underlying it is that makes those limitations. You can kind of think about it as akin to driving a car. Kind of what the car can and can't do. You don't necessarily know exactly why it can and can't do it. Some people know a little bit more technically, like, when I turn the steering wheel, this is what happens. These are the mechanisms that happen. But, even then, some cars are, drive-by-wire now, which means that they don't have a direct mechanical linkage from the steering wheel to the tires anymore. And a lot of people still think it works that way. So I think people certainly need to know what the limitations are. They need to know, what to be aware of. They need to know how the technology works. They need to know how to get what they want out of the technology. But they probably don't, not everybody needs to know how the underlying aspects of the technology, functions at a low level in order to make use of it. Again, the ethical challenges here, I think are kind of in an interesting place now, or maybe more correctly, the ethical challenges kind of show that we're, as a society, in an interesting place, where as the technology, the LLM technology and the AI technologies are doing more and more of the stuff that used to be high value human work, we now have a question of, well, should we be using them in this way? Is this the the most effective thing for technologies to be doing? And maybe the most fundamental question of, well, if we all agree that the technology does this as well, that it does it better, that it provides some benefit, that humans don't have. What does that mean for the human? What does the human go on to do at that point? And I think that's kind of maybe the most profound question, of our time right now is again, what is left for the human? What does it make sense for a human to do in an age where AI does some of the things that used to be the things that humans were, best at? Humans, were essential to, and it does them very well, and it does it faster, and it does it less expensively in some cases than humans, but maybe lacks certain aspects of it. And again, therein lies the challenge, and therein lies our great societal question.
Thank you. And in terms of the way in which LLMs as a kind of representative of generative AI have developed, what is it particularly, do you think, about generative AI that makes it new, distinctive, or different from what we've seen before with the likes of autocorrect or the likes of using spelling and grammar check on our PCs perhaps for some time? What is it distinctively that causes these challenges when it comes to generative AI?
Well, I think from a writing perspective, the previous tools, and I mean, there was a kind of a period of blurring, right? Because some of the tools that used to, suggest, spelling correction now try to autocomplete a sentence, and even sometimes will go beyond a sentence into, two sentences. But I think what has changed is you have tools now where you can go to the tool and say, hey, I want a paper on this topic, and give it very little information about, exactly what you want, and have it produce something that is, a reasonable, result from that. If you think about kind of from the role of an educator, if you go to a student and you say, hey, our paper topic is this, here are the 5 guidelines, it doesn't take much changing to put that into an LLM and have the LLM produce the exact thing that, that a teacher has assigned. And, I think, again, that's the kind of big difference between the, okay, well, you misspelled this word, but you were the one that came up with the idea of how to structure this. You were the one that came up with the idea of, what words to use. Even, the autocorrect where it was giving you the end of the sentence, it's still, you'd put a lot into that sentence, hopefully, before, it added a few words that were kind of a logical conclusion to it, or suggested that, your phrasing might be kind of awkward or whatever. Whereas, again, now the LLM kind of does the whole thing just from the tasking. And, the thing that gets challenging here, too, is that students and people in general use LLMs in very different ways. Somebody could take, like I just said, take the assignment and just put it in and say, okay, whatever comes out is the answer. But then you can also have somebody that takes a much more thoughtful approach that actually says, okay, well, this is the way that I want to structure it. I want, here's my introduction. Here's what I want is kind of my transition. Here are the other things, where they really do kind of the design work for the piece, and then the LLM fills in a lot of the details. And certainly there are questions. Obviously, if the rule was no LLMs for any of it, both of those would be on the wrong side of the rule. But I think there is a difference between those two approaches, where one is basically the human or the student taking the assignment from one place, putting it into the other place, and then moving the thing back. I mean, they're basically acting as as the I don't know what exactly the best analog. I kind of think of like the mailroom cart person, where they take the assignment, put it on the cart, take it over to the other desk, wait for it to be completed, and bring it back. But the second example, where the person is putting thought into it and kind of doing the design, is a very different process. It's a much more thoughtful process. And again, exactly where we end up, what our expectations are for humans in education, what our expectations are for humans in the workforce. Even thinking about like the arts, what are our expectations for humans in the arts? Are we going to let somebody fill in a lot of this stuff? These are open questions. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting, not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but in a lot of the great painters, they would have their apprentices actually fill in a lot of the detail in their painting. They would do the kind of the broad brush strokes and figure out the painting and whatnot, but they didn't sit there putting in every little stroke of paint. So, could we see AI as akin to that, where somebody does the high level design? They say, this is what I want, but then the AI fills in a lot of the details, and that's okay. And again, in some environments that may be perfectly acceptable, and others it may not be. But that's one way that we could be using AI in the future. The other way is that we could be doing something completely different, where every book becomes a journey through multiple paths through a narrative, where the quote unquote author, the person that's the designer of the story, kind of lays out a framework and some parameters, but an LLM is generating text kind of on the fly, depending on choices that a reader makes. That would be a way of using the technology to produce a very different type of art, but arguably one that still has a kind of key human handprint on it from the initial design. So I think it'll be really interesting to see where all of this stuff leads. And I think a big thing right now is as educators, we're trying to prepare students for this next phase of human society without really knowing exactly what it's going to be like. And that's challenging, right? Because you don't know what skills the students are going to need, particularly if you're thinking about a student at the college level where what class do I teach a freshman, not knowing what the industry or what the workforce is going to be like in 4 years, or thinks about somebody that's in like middle school or beginning high school, where you again have that same 4, 5, 6 year time frame where you're trying to think of, well, what information do I impart them with, what skills do I impart them with to prepare them, when you don't really know where things are going to be in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more years. So it's a very challenging time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've often had the thought about how close this potentially co-composition process, which is what we've been touching on here, I think, is to the process in the development of conceptual art, where, as you say, you have one particular lead artist who comes up with the idea and the design, and then the individual assistants who assemble all the bits of the pieces that need to be assembled to produce the finished article. I've had a little bit of experience of that while doing some AI co-composition of some music, actually, around a suite of poems by the American poet Emily Dickinson, and actually taking the words and working with them to turn them into a kind of libretto or set of lyrics that would work for some AI-generated music, and then watching the process of having to go through maybe 25, 30 drafts of different AI outputs to tweak them gradually to get something like what you're looking for. There was quite a lot of thought involved in the process, but the challenge as to how you would describe it afterwards was quite something to consider, whether it's a piece that's been set or a piece that's been adapted or a piece that's a variation on. It leads you into some quite tricky territory in terms of, I suppose, intellectual rights.
Well, I think that's a good question, and certainly if you look at the credits for a movie of any size, there are hundreds and hundreds of names there. So we're very used to artwork or products that have been created by large groups of people. But there is a challenge of how do you accurately describe that, whether it's from a kind of truth in advertising perspective, or from just making sure that everybody kind of gets the appropriate credit, including the people that make the technologies that may be helping in this. And I'm not sure we've figured out exactly what the norms are around that. And I think, again, that's part of the challenge right now, is that people are trying, in some cases, to very ethically describe what they're doing, and there's not perfect terminology. So you have, on one hand, you don't want to write a book about the same length about how you made the book, because nobody's going to read it, and nobody's going to, any benefit of conveying the contributions is lost if nobody's going to read about those contributions. On the other hand, if you summarize that using imprecise terminology, you run the risk of not accurately describing, all the different ways and mechanisms that were used to aid in something. And I think the question of what is the quote unquote work of the artist, or the work of the writer, or the work of in any other field where that attribution is important, that's something that we, as a society, we probably need to define. And I think we've had this challenge before, again, coming back to the painting, where you don't say this is a painting by this famous artist and these other 50 people. Normally, when you think about the the great famous artworks, even though people that are art historians and people that are involved in looking at this know that these people had other people that helped with them or helped them with the work, we still say this is a painting by this great painter, not this great painter and their 50 apprentices or their 25 other staff member. Similarly, when we look at a speech that's given by a famous person, a lot of times those speeches are they have speech writers that write them, Everybody kind of knows that it happens. Maybe not everybody knows exactly to what extent, what was the person who's standing at the podium's contribution to it, and what was the person who wrote most or some or all of the speech as contribution. But yet, when we refer to the speech from the leader, from the executive or whatever, we talk about it being their speech because they're the one who stands behind what was said. They're the one that's presenting it. They're the one who the ideas, at least, if not the actual wording, is attributed to. And so, again, we have different norms in different areas, and we don't have well-established norms in this area, which makes it difficult while that's happening. And also, with the technology kind of continuing to move and change in terms of its capabilities, it makes it very difficult to catch up in terms of, well, how do we refer to something when, halfway through the discussion of, okay, well, the AI can kind of do this, up to this point. So, but now it can go beyond that. And now we have to kind of restart the whole discussion again, because the capability, and how far the technology can go has again leaped forward faster than we can have the discussion about how to refer to it, much less all the other discussions about, should this be used? Does it make sense for it to be used? What are the limitations? What are the, ethical considerations? What are legal considerations? Copyright, patents, et cetera. And so again, we have a challenge of the technologies moving much faster than our societal discussion of it, our legal framework for, regulating or even just dealing with, civil suits, et cetera, relating to use, misuse, et cetera, of the technology. So it's a very challenging time. And again, this isn't new. I mean, technology has at many times during human civilization moved faster than humans' ability to ask the, kind of important fundamental ethical questions, ask the questions of should we, can we, does it make sense to, in addition to the question of, are we technically able to do this? And again, we're moving really quickly right now. We have a technology that's advancing very quickly right now. So it's an exciting time from that perspective, but also a challenging time as we try to figure out how to integrate that into our society, how to prepare students to use the technology, to be leaders in the technology, and so forth. So very, very interesting time.
I suppose as well, one thing that I've noticed, certainly over the last 12 months, is not just the degree to which AI is stepping into that space of grand human creativity, but also stepping into that space of mundane human productivity or seeming productivity. And that's the deluge of AI tools that we now seem to have every time we open up a Microsoft Office suite. Is there a sense that we might be running to why not justifications a bit more quickly than use cases, which is something we used to hear about quite a lot?
Well, I think it's certainly, there's a challenge from the perspective of a software developer to try to continue to make their product feel relevant, particularly for something that has a subscription model where, people haven't bought it and then, expect to wait a few years and then buy something else. And so with so many pieces of software now being on these kind of monthly subscription models, whether you're paying for it yourself or getting it through, your employer or a different way, I think it's changed the mindset where companies feel the need to kind of add stuff. And not all of the features that are added necessarily are going to be things that everybody wants to use. Some of them may be things that almost nobody wants to use. But it certainly, I think there is more of an interest in pushing features now to try to keep people feeling like, okay, I know what I'm paying for this month, even though, from a practical perspective, with a word processing program where you historically might have paid a few $100s for it once, now you're paying, $10, $15, whatever it is per month. You're paying about the same, particularly if you were updating the software every time there was a new release. It's the pricing, the actual money that the company gets from selling the software hasn't changed tremendously. And certainly if you're only using the software for 6 months or say, something like that, you may not be paying as much as you would have if you bought it and then stopped using it after a few months. But again, I think because of the subscription models, there is a lot more of an impetus to be making additions and changes to the product. And some of these features can be very helpful to some people. Sometimes one of the challenges that happens too is, a feature is added where a subset of users find it very helpful, but not enough find it helpful, so it's taken back out. because the software company doesn't want to have to pay to maintain it when it's not being used by very many people. And so not only do you get the kind of barrage of features and then have to figure out which ones, if any, are ones you want to use, but then you also run the risk of having a feature that you really like and then having it disappear in a future release. So I mean, it is a again, a changing time in terms of software development. Another thing that kind of comes into this is the fact that features can be developed very quickly now using AI type software development. A lot of people call this quote unquote vibe coding, where as opposed to writing lots and lots of code to make one of these features, you simply describe the feature and then the AI makes the code to make it work. And hopefully somebody, whether it's a human or an automated process, or ideally a combination of both, is actually testing it before it gets put out there. We're certainly seeing some issues with that not happening enough. But again, it certainly is a lot faster to make a new feature in a piece of software right now than it was even, say, 5 years ago, when so much of this coding was being done by hand.
Well, thanks, Jeremy, for that background on the developments that we've seen, certainly since the 1990s, and that seem to be increasing in their speed over the last few years. That's opened up the conversation, I think, really nicely for where we're hoping to go for the rest of the show. In the second part of the show, I'd like us to explore some of your thoughts on how AI has begun to impact educational systems from your perspective, and the young people who are obliged to navigate them, if that's okay.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
And before that, here's Joe Fox with the news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This week covers the news that Department for Education updated guidance says oversubscribed schools must not prioritise admitting pupils via managed moves over those already on their waiting lists, unless they better fit their criteria. The guidance is in its update around suspensions and permanent exclusions, which also includes a crackdown on off-rolling, removals for safeguarding reasons, and information tracking. The managed move guidance states that when transfers are taking place to an oversubscribed school, the pupil must not be admitted ahead of pupils on a waiting list where the school is operating one. Previous guidance said that parents should not be pressured into a managed move, but the new guidance explicitly says that a pupil must not be permanently excluded because of their parents' refusal to agree to a managed move. Trial managed moves are not allowed. Critical information sharing now must take place between the original and new school in all circumstances and in advance of the managed move. Further details, including examples of off-rolling, temporary removals for safeguarding reasons, directions off-site, and pupil voice, are all available online. Following a week of really hot weather, the TES magazine covers warnings from teaching bodies over concerns about the impact of extreme heat in classrooms. Research last year from the Department for Education found that without action, pupils could potentially lose up to 12 days of learning per year on average due to climate change, although these days did include days lost to flooding and other impacts of climate change beyond extreme heat. The Climate Change Committee published a report advocating the introduction of maximum temperature regulations in workplaces, which included schools and colleges. The CCC report says that taking an exam in 32 degrees C heat leads to around a 10% lower likelihood of passing, compared to a 22 degrees C day. The proposed target of 16 degrees to 25 degrees C is not due until 2050. Union reaction and more details can be found on TES magazine website. The BBC Northern Ireland news site reports on success for a pupil-run business. The company, set up and run by pupils at Park Special School, recently won 2 top prizes at the Young Enterprise Northern Ireland Awards. Their company, called Where's My Keys, makes and sells gifts, keyrings and sensory items. They used the £1,700 profit to buy every pupil in the school an Easter egg. The story contains lots of comment from the pupils involved and the impact of the project that's had on confidence, as well as learning about finance, branding and budgeting. Finally, the BBC African news site reports the sad news of the death of 16 students in a fire at a school in Kenya. The recent tragedy follows a string of deadly fires at boarding schools in recent years in the country. Authorities are investigating, but parents of the students have been questioning how prepared boarding schools are for fires and whether dormitories meet safety standards. In addition to the 16 fatalities, 79 students were injured. 800 children were in the school at the time of the fire. Full details on BBC News. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back to our show on the impact of educational AI on teachers, students and educational systems with computer science academic and university instructor Dr. Jeremy Straub. We began this evening with an overview of some of the surprising ways in which we have come to rely on AI tools since the millennium and how this technology has evolved in recent years. Now, Jeremy, I would like us to reflect upon how AI has begun to impact the business of teaching, learning, and research in our academic institutions. So, in your university, Jeremy, what do young undergraduates and early career academics use AI tools for in 2026?
Well, I think, the answer is probably almost everything that that the tools are able to do, even if that is sometimes, particularly in the case of some of the students, something they're not supposed to be doing. But certainly there's a lot of different uses of AI tools that are very relevant to higher education and really all of education. Everything from making more interesting slide decks. I know I was just doing a presentation for some colleagues where I showed just very quickly in the presentation how I made an infographic that I added to a slide deck that people were really interested in, because it was, these used to be very difficult to make. They used to take quite a lot of time to make an infographic, and now you can make an infographic with a single prompt to a tool like ChatGPT or Claude or several other tools. So there's a lot of great things that can be done in that regard. There's also the challenge on the other side of students using the tools in some cases to basically do assignments for them, where the students are not really getting the educational value out of doing the assignment, and the ability to assess whether they are learning the material or have learned the material is being very negatively impacted by their use of the tool. So there's certainly a lot of different ways that the students, faculty, and others are using these tools. And again, like what we were talking about in the previous segment, we don't really have norms yet. We have some classes where it may be more appropriate to use an AI tool than in other classes. I mean, I teach classes on AI. The students are expected to use AI in those classes and wouldn't get a very good grade if they didn't, because they're learning how to use the tools in those classes. On the other hand, they turn around and they use the tool inappropriately in another class where they're supposed to be doing their own work, and they can get in quite a lot of trouble for that. So, it's a very interesting time. And, are we going to get to a point where AI use is the same in every class? Probably not. Are we going to get to a point where institutions begin to have policies that are a little bit more normative between different classes? I think we're seeing a movement in that direction. Exactly how far that goes, whether that turns out to be a good or bad thing as we look back on it, with the benefit of hindsight, where those rules may be making it difficult for people on either end of the educational spectrum. Some that are trying to, use the new technologies in the class, they're being told, hey, you need to step back from that a little bit. And others that, perhaps don't want the technology used at all, that are being pulled forward. Or maybe that's a good thing, of getting everybody a little bit closer to, consistent use, to make it so the students are not legitimately confused between when and where and how they're supposed to be using the tools. But certainly is a very, very interesting time from that perspective as well.
Are your different faculties finding that the needs of such policies need to be specific to that discipline, or are you finding that they're encountering similar problems across disciplines?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this. I mean, I think certainly the what each class is trying to generate in terms of learning outcomes is going to differ significantly between disciplines. So, something where the use of, say, a writing aid might be perceived very differently in a class that is teaching the skill of writing versus a class that is trying to teach another skill where writing is essential to that, but it's not the skill that's being focused on. And then you get into kind of the supplemental outcomes. If an instructor is saying, well, I want people to learn about chemistry, but I also want to try to improve their communication skills, and you're making learning outcomes associated with those communication skills, and students are using the AI tools in such a way that they're not doing that they're kind of bypassing that by letting the tool do it for them. You get into a challenge. And so you kind of have to look at this as a matrix in terms of, well, what are the program goals? What are the goals, in a particular discipline? What is the way that a particular teacher is approaching trying to teach those goals? What are kind of some of the supplementary outcomes that they're looking at trying to, encourage the students to develop during that? And, then how does the AI tool fit within all of these different considerations? And then you get to a whole nother consideration, which is faculty comfort and awareness of the AI tools, where, even if a tool might fit very well in a particular context, if the faculty member doesn't know how to use it, doesn't realize that the tool works in a certain way, doesn't understand what both its benefits and limitations are, it's going to be very difficult for them to incorporate that as well. And, as I said a minute ago, these tools are moving quite rapidly. So, even if you think you kind of know where everything is at the moment, certainly that can change quite quickly. And, we use a tool in the Center for Cybersecurity and AI that includes a lot of it. It basically includes API access, where the thing that we log into can go out and connect to all these different AI tools. And there's like 5,000 some odd tools that this can connect to. And, so again, imagine all of that. If you tell somebody to write a poem and you didn't realize that there is a tool that specifically writes poems, you may be very surprised at the level of aid students are able to get on that if you didn't know, a particular technology exists. So it's just a very, very complex landscape when you're trying to think about how to best incorporate this into a class. And I think, we also at some point, hopefully, will move beyond, the question of, well, what do we do right now? We have existing curricula, we have existing ways of teaching it. We know that these ways work to some extent because we've evaluated that. We know that there are other ways of teaching it, and maybe those ways haven't been evaluated. And then we have this, this challenge, this even change really of all this new technology showing up, which potentially can enable completely different ways of teaching as well. But we don't have the the research kind of surrounding that to know how effective it is, to know, even if we think, okay, well, this approach may be very effective, how do we best implement it? What are student perceptions going to be? Is this going to cause problems? And so at some point, hopefully, we'll move from the question of, okay, how do we kind of keep the boat afloat right now where all these changes are happening and, people weren't necessarily preparing for them. They weren't necessarily expecting them to, okay, we have this technology that can help us. How do we best use that? How do we, start saying, well, what does a student need to do when they graduate from this course, from this program? And then how do we try to shape what we're doing in the course and in the program to prepare them for that? And, from my perspective, I think what we might see is a lot more involved student work where, it may used to be that we had students that might do a book report. Well, writing a book report is something an LLM can do, basically with a single prompt now. So that's not very high value human work anymore. How could we make that more involved? How could we add something to that requires the student to do something and also teaches them a skill that they can then apply later on? But also conversely, if we need them to know what exactly goes into making a book report, if that's a skill where we need them to understand kind of the mechanisms behind it, how do we get them to do that a few times so they learn it without just simply telling the tool to do it? And the only thing that they know is, well, when I need a book report, I type in this prompt into the tool. And again, that's the big challenge. And maybe the bigger challenge is figuring out what skills are still essential for students to learn versus what skills we can say, this is something where the tech is always going to be a good way of doing this. Maybe this is something where we displace this skill and we teach them something else instead. And again, that becomes kind of challenging and also very much a value judgment as well. So it is a very complex environment from an educational perspective right now.
Yeah, I can certainly see circumstances where, as I was saying in the introduction, the unsupervised assessment of students by written term papers is going to prove challenging, isn't it, in the new AI landscape, particularly in big institutions where the instructors don't get to regularly see the handwritten work of students. I think if you're running a course of maybe 500 students on it, and the course might be farmed out for assessment to individual tutors who might mark 2 essays from students across the whole course, that's got to pose real challenges for authenticity and academic integrity, hasn't it?
I mean, I think trying to authenticate student work in that way, I mean, AI is very good at sounding like, people you tell it to sound like. If there's not somebody sitting there watching people write, I presume that there's probably some technology out there that can do a pretty good job of simulating people's handwriting as well. I know there have been some instances where even with some of like the remotely proctored systems, people have found ways around that. Not all of those use AI, though some of those are just kind of clever ways of hiding stuff in places where the camera doesn't see type stuff. But I mean, each of these technological solutions, quote unquote, that students may use, or even, non-technological solutions such as finding a place to tug a note card where the camera is not going to see. They're changing the quality of the assessment. They're making it so the assessment is not assessing quite what is hoped to be assessing. So if you're assuming that you're assessing whether a student is retaining information by asking them these questions, and they figure out a way again to tuck a note card off somewhere where they can look at it and see the whatever notes they have on it, you're not assessing memorization in the same way that you might be if you had somebody sitting in front of you in a room where they can't do that. On the other hand, I mean, there's certainly no shortage of ways that students have found to cheat in physical settings, looking off neighbors' papers, again, having the note card somewhere where they can look at it on the back of their hand, bottom of their shoe, whatever it may be. So, I mean, this isn't new. It's just maybe a different way, in some cases, maybe a more technologically advanced way, in some cases, a way where you have a, technological supervision that's not working entirely in the way that you're hoping for it to do, because of the ingenuity of students to find ways around actually learning stuff and instead find ways of answering questions without having to memorize or whatever they may be doing.
What about the ingenuity of the AI detector systems? There's been some dispute about these over here in the UK over the last 2 years. Are we moving towards a stage where AI is getting better at identifying its AI colleagues, or is there still some way to go down that road?
I mean, I don't think the systems are ever going to be as effective as they would need to be used in the way I think a lot of people would like for them to be used. I mean, I think a lot of teachers would like to be able to just supply the document and have a green check or a red X, that it is either human generated or AI generated. And I think there are two different challenges that are presented. The first is that probably most students are not going to one extreme or the other, where the document is completely generated by AI or completely generated by them. And so, you have this kind of mixing and melding where the student is doing something, maybe in some cases a lot more than in other cases. And then, also the AI is doing something. And how do you figure out whether that's, quote unquote AI generated, short of literally sitting there and watching the student, compose the work and seeing, where they used AI and when they used AI. And then also, you get to the question of, well, what if the student, has the AI write the essay and they get the benefit of the broad knowledge of the AI and the AI doing all the research, but then they sit down and they, write the essay kind of in their own words. So they're plagiarizing in terms of the production of the essay, but not in terms of the specific form of written expression, in that they have come up with every sentence on their own, loosely paraphrasing, again, still plagiarizing, again, the overarching concept of the work, but not the, not the specific representation. You also get into the kind of interesting copyright questions there as well, because that's a derivative work, but copyright protects a specific form of expression. And as you get more and more away from, a photocopy of something, as it becomes more of a discussion of it, a derivative work, et cetera, the copyright implications become a little bit different as well too. So, again, there's a lot of kind of interesting questions surrounding this. But in terms of the AI detection, I mean, I think the only way to really solve the problem of making sure that students are learning the material is to give them mechanisms to demonstrate that learning that are what you're hoping that they're going to be able to do. And so, if we say, hey, we want you to learn how to be able to produce, an essay that has these characteristics, and you learn how to do that really well with AI, that may be a good outcome. It may be that the student hasn't learned all the skills that they would have needed to do that 5 years ago, but they're learning the skills that they need to do that, today. And so if we make it so that what we're assessing actually is very well aligned with the outcomes that we're hoping to have, as opposed to kind of surrogate measures, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky with the scaffolding, because sometimes you want them to know, certain things to scaffold later learning. And if you can't measure the scaffolding anymore, that can be tricky. But, again, at the end of the day, if our goal is to have, students that can do thing X, and we figure out how to test that they're doing thing X, maybe it doesn't matter so much that they're doing it with AI if it's a type of thing that they would always have that AI to be able to do. Now, I mean, the caveat here is, when you're teaching somebody to be the emergency room physician and they have to be able to also practice medicine when an AI is not available because there's a power outage, they need to be able to do that. And if they're using the AI as a crutch always, that's not a skill that they're developing. So, even if we're saying, okay, well, we need to match the assessment very well to what we're actually hoping the student's going to be doing eventually, we do need to think about the cases where the AI may not be available. And if they have to be able to perform the skill without the AI, then we need to make sure that they've learned how to perform the skill without the AI. So it's a very tricky set of considerations, and a lot of different nuance to it that, again, varies pretty significantly by discipline and by what a student is trying to learn to do and what you're trying to impart in terms of knowledge and skills to the student, and how they may use those eventually.
Yeah, it's interesting, those two particular areas you've touched on, because, I mean, over here at the moment, we have a minister for our healthcare system, our national healthcare system here, talking about productivity benefits that might follow from using AI in medical contexts. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got the challenge that we're being confronted with, particularly in the arts and humanities, where some students going on to, for instance, fine art writing courses are perhaps so over-reliant on AI that when they step away from it, it's creeping into their natural sentence formulations. And you can see the evidence of ChatGPT or Gemini or any of the other systems kind of infiltrating their writing to the point that they're expressing themselves in an AI style, even if they're not using AI to produce the writing. What's your thoughts on those two extremes?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting phenomena. I mean, certainly, humans have always been influenced by by their surroundings. And so it's not surprising that, people that are using AI a lot are taking things that they like from that. I mean, I don't think I ever used the word delve too much before we all started hearing about the word delve as kind of an AI signaling mechanism. But, I kind of like the word delve. It works in certain ways where you say, oh, I want to delve into that, where there may not have been another great transition for that, dig into it, dive into it. Delve is doesn't imply digging or diving. I used to say, and I still say this a lot in some of my recorded lecture videos, let's go ahead and jump right in to it. But delve would probably actually be as good or maybe even a better word there. It's just not the way I've historically said it. So, I mean, I think it's interesting that, people are beginning to learn from the AI, to model the AI. Of course, the AI learned from and modeled humans as well. So it's kind of an interesting reflection of humanity back onto itself with the aid of a piece of software in the middle. I don't think it's necessarily going to be tremendously problematic. But again, I mean, you don't really know with a lot of these things until you see what happens over a period of time. I think as long as people can still express themselves, and they're saying what they're hoping to say, the exact way that they say it, if they've been influenced by AI, probably isn't that big of a thing. But I'm sure that there are some that people in like disciplines like poetry or fine arts, where that expression is so integral to the discipline that might see that in a more concerning way than I do, looking at it from kind of a more engineering and computing perspective, where in some cases it's maybe a little bit more about conveying the information than necessarily the exact way that you convey the information in a lot of cases. But it certainly is. It's another one of these really interesting kind of phenomena that we're getting to explore, like it or not, in some cases, with the introduction of AI.
Yeah, I rather fear for the lifespan of the semicolon, based on what I've seen so far over the last few months in some of the writing samples I've seen. But yeah, there's certainly that sense, isn't there, that our language has always evolved, and perhaps this might just be a tool that helps us evolve in new ways that we haven't perhaps realized we might develop yet. So there's always that, I suppose. What about the medical example, though? Have you got much experience of that in the United States at the moment?
I mean, I think there are a lot of people that are using AI in medicine, both in terms of kind of formal studies. There's some work going on in a number of institutions relating to using AI to aid. So there's been some work in teleoperated surgery where you had a human doing the surgery. I've heard a little bit kind of mentions at conferences of how they're looking at how the AI can kind of help in certain circumstances. So I think there's a little bit of work going on there. I'm not sure if there's been a ton of publications on that yet, but it sounds like that's an area that's being explored. And then there's also a lot of informal things. I was reading an article. I don't remember what subdiscipline of medicine it is offhand, but they were talking about how they were doing making some kind of bespoke applications, for their particular subdiscipline within medicine using, vibe coding tools. And, they published about this in one of the kind of journals or magazines related to their discipline, and kind of talking about some of the benefits that they were, having from it. But one of the things from the perspective of somebody that kind of looks at this from the computational side that I took away from this is that it didn't seem like they knew a lot about the data security implications of some of the stuff that they were doing. It didn't seem like they knew a whole lot about like the testing aspect of developing an application where it might be used for this. And so, you do get into kind of a challenging perspective there where, certainly having somebody that knows the medical aspect of it is absolutely essential. But we also need to make sure, that we're, particularly if we have patient data that's being stored and that's sensitive data, that, somebody or some process is looking at this to make sure that the data is being secured properly. If we're doing a system, kind of like going back to the early systems that helps, physicians understand what the condition may be, we need to make sure that the logic behind that actually makes sense. There is the benefit of the fact that hopefully it's just suggesting what the condition may be. But again, if physicians get too comfortable with the software being right most of the time, you run the risk of the fact that they may not be looking at those as recommendations to be kind of evaluated by them primarily, and just saying, well, this is mostly right. This sounds kind of right. Let's go ahead and do this. And and again, in 99 cases out of 100, maybe the software is right, and then in one case it critically fails. If the human didn't catch that could have a very negative result, ranging from a patient not receiving the treatment that they could have and their condition further deteriorating to them receiving a treatment that may not actually be a good treatment. The flip side of this is that, of course, medical issues happen, with humans as well. There's no shortage of human-produced medical malpractice, medical mess-ups. And so, we expect the electronic systems to be maybe more perfect than we expect the humans to be. And, we kind of come to another one of these societal questions here of, well, how good does the system need to be before we say, that's good enough to be able to make a decision on its own? Is it just simply, it needs to be better than the human? Is it that it needs to be, 10% better than the human or 50% better than the human? And we get into that. I mean, we hear about that a lot with self-driving cars as well. They get into accidents, but humans get into a lot of automotive accidents. And, the general kind of knowledge that, again, nobody has all of the data, I think, for some of this stuff other than the makers of the systems themselves, because there's a lot of unreported accidents or little things that, they may have on their radar that the rest of us never find out about. But the general reported trends in terms of self-driving vehicles, autonomous vehicles, is that they're significantly safer than humans, even though they sometimes, catastrophically fail. So again, you get into this question of, well, when do we say that this is good enough? When do we say that this is, it's doing so much better than the human that we're better on relying on the technology, maybe with the human in an oversight role, than the technology advising the human. And again, from an educational perspective, that dramatically changes what we're preparing a student to do. If they're going to be the supervisor of a system versus the driver of a vehicle, those are two very different job roles. So it kind of is another interesting conundrum that again kind of spans all the way from the workforce, the research that's going into these areas, all the way back to what are we actually trying to prepare students to do, and trying to guess what will be the job of 2, 3, 4 or more years from now.
That's a great point, actually, about the self-driving cars. I mean, I think we've also had autopilots in commercial airlines for quite a while now, haven't we? But again, we're not at the stage yet where I imagine we'd be prepared to let the autopilot take the entire flight from takeoff to landing. Do you think we need specific courses then in developing student understanding and competence in AI in our schools, colleges, and universities? I mean, do our research methods courses need to be reshaped so that our students are familiar with what AI can do, what it can't do, what it should do, what it shouldn't do at a much earlier age?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I think everybody is going to be living and working in an era where AI is playing an important role, and so getting people to understand what the human job role is in that environment is very important. The challenge with this is I'm not sure, as a society, we understand what the human job role in this environment is. So if you don't know what the answer to the question is, how do you convey that answer to the student? That becomes a very challenging environment to try to teach in when you don't really know what the student needs to learn. To go back just for a second to your example of the autopilots too, there's a really kind of interesting story in there. Airlines and airplanes that have the robust autopilots, not the ones that you might find on a small Cessna where it just kind of holds on a path, but they really can go from at airports that are equipped with special equipment for this, they can go all the way from takeoff to landing, and they do it very well. And in fact, in some cases, under certain atmospheric conditions, you have to use these systems, as I understand it, to land at certain airports where you're not allowed to do this manually or without significant assistance because things like visibility issues, et cetera. Similarly, these technologies allow us to have the planes closer together than might have otherwise been possible. They do a lot of neat things. And one of the challenges here, and this is where it kind of ties back into this question, one of the challenges that we have is that pilots were using these systems so much that there was a concern that they wouldn't be able to fly the plane if they actually had to, if the system failed, if the system said, I don't know what to do in this circumstance, so I'm turning off. And so one of the things that, at least in the United States, pilots have to do a certain amount of manual flying, despite the fact that the system can do that particular flight for them, just to continue to retain their skill set so that in the event of a system failure, in the event of an emergency, they still have that skill set. So we have a very specific work role here of the pilot being, needing to be able to handle every aspect of the flight in this, this very unlikely condition where the this autopilot system fails, despite the fact that the autopilot systems are so reliable that this isn't happening with enough frequency that absent a specific requirement to fly without the autopilot, the pilots would be developing that capability naturally, or retaining, maybe more correctly, that capability naturally. And so, again, in this instance, you have, a lot of people working in aviation. People identified as this, this is a concern. Plans were made to ensure that that pilots retain those skills. But that's a very specific example. Now, what skills do we need to have a student learn to go into aviation? Well, they still need to know how to fly the plane, specifically because of the fact that they're going to be doing it, occasionally, or one, they're going to be doing it occasionally to maintain their competence, and two, that the fact that there's an expectation that they know how to do it in the case of an emergency system failure. So that gives us a very strong set of requirements. It explains, okay, well, why are we teaching people how to learn how to fly planes as opposed to, other skills? But it doesn't really deal with the, well, is this the most effective use of people sitting in a cockpit when in fact they're not having to do much in 99.999 or so about percent of the time, because the autopilot is doing most of the work in most circumstances. So in some ways, that the airline example or the airplane example kind of highlights the conundrum that we're facing more broadly, but it also then has this safety requirement that helps answer the question that we're lacking in so many other areas.
Well, I mean, that's really quite fascinating, actually, that I wasn't aware that we relied so much on AI. And I suppose it comes down to that sense of the fact that it's not very often communicated, or indeed communicated at all, that the commercial flights we may be taking on our holidays have been AI assisted, is it?
Well, I think there's part of that. I mean, I think people, certainly feel comfortable having pilots on the plane. I think if you tried to remove the pilots, there would be public backlash against that. It may not be very long-lived public backlash. Again, another example, those little trams that many airports have. When at some point in history, and I don't know a whole lot about this other than the one thing that I'm going to just mention, but at some point in history, I guess those must have had a human operator on them. And those human operators got removed, and there was public backlash of people saying, well, what could go wrong with these trams? And then nothing did. And, the trams operated reliably for so long that now, we all get into those little trams, without really thinking about it. Elevators in certain areas used to have humans that operated them. Now, I don't think I've ever been in an elevator that has had, a designated human elevator operator to it. But, you still see some old movies and, other things that kind of show back to that history of, the elevator operator. So I think, could we have fully autonomous flights at some point? I think absolutely. I mean, even a situation where maybe you have one crew member on board, whose normal duties are to manage the passengers in the cabin, help with the service, but they have enough training and they get that training regularly enough that if something really goes wrong, they're at least going to be able to be walked through from the ground, over the radio. This is what you need to do to bring the plane in for a landing. I mean, I think we could end up at that, that circumstance, not too far in the future. And I think from a technical perspective, we could get there pretty quickly. I think, there's not really a tremendous push towards doing that. I don't think there's any airline that really wants to be the first to remove the pilots and get kind of the political backlash from that, and then the safety concern backlash from that. But eventually, if somebody does it, maybe it's a small a startup airline that wants to avail themselves of the reduced staffing costs of not having pilots on planes, and they somehow or another convince a regulator somewhere in the world to let them do that, and they do it successfully for months or years. I mean, you'd have to expect other airlines are going to follow suit. So again, I think from a technical perspective, I don't think we're too far off from being able to do that. There probably are some additional safety technologies and certainly some differences in how you would build a plane for that type of thing, where you put controls, et cetera. But again, there's a completely different calculus related to that in terms of, are people going to want to get onto that plane? And I think right now the answer is probably not, but that could change pretty quickly if somebody showed that you could do it safely.
Well, indeed. And I think we might touch on this in the final segment of the show, actually. The thoughts of how we navigate our way forward from here in practical, ethical, and development terms are quite far-reaching, actually. And I wonder if we have really quite grasped the sense that every single industrial revolution we go through generates some quite significant upheavals in the society that industrial revolution is supposed to serve. I mean, we often hear about AI being mooted as heralding the third industrial revolution by the same people that seem to forget just how much every aspect of human existence was transformed by the upheavals that accompanied the previous two industrial revolutions. So perhaps in the final part of the show then, with the aircraft example in mind, we might have a go at reading some of the tea leaves and asking ourselves what implications the inevitable upheavals that come with the widespread adoption of AI tools might have for our educational institutions, our established systems of assessment and research, and perhaps more significantly, based on what we've been exploring in this segment, the workplace itself and what that workplace might look like. And we'll be right back after this.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Welcome back to the final part of our show on educational AI and its effects on teachers, learners and systems with Jeremy Straub. So far, we have considered the development of AI tools since millennium. We've thought about how AI is currently being utilized in our educational institutions, and we've started to consider some of the implications that AI might have for shaping our learners for the workplace, whether that's in the sky or whether that's on our roads. So in this final part of the show, I would like to explore some of the ways in which our existing ways of delivering effective teaching, learning, research, and workplace training might need to adapt to address a world in which AI is an indispensable component of our daily life in developed societies. So then, Jeremy, we talked a little bit about our school and college curriculum offers and how they might need to change to perhaps reconfigure our sense of what we understand by the term research. How are your millennial academics getting on with negotiating this relationship between using AI tools and preparing original research?
Well, I think we're certainly seeing a lot of challenges in terms of the expectations of being able to use a tool in a certain way, and perhaps expectations within various disciplines, within various publishing bodies, where they're not quite ready for that yet. There's certainly a lot of I think back and forth between certain associations and journals and whatnot that are saying you can use AI in this way and this way and this way, but not in these other ways. And some people that are saying, well, why would I do this myself when the tool can do this as effectively or more effectively than I can? And there's some conflict there. I think one of the challenges is that just like in the broader question of what is the role of the human in society, in the workforce, with AI able to do some of these things that used to be very high value human activities, you end up with a very similar question in terms of academic research, which is what exactly is the role of the human in the academic research world, particularly if we have AIs that are not only actually doing experiments and writing up the results and doing the analysis, but also even coming up with the ideas for them. And in some cases, the way that these ideas are being arrived at is very formulaic, where you just try 15 things in a row and one of them works, and that's great. I also kind of come back though, if you look at Thomas Edison's famous quote about perspiration, not inspiration, being a significant amount of the scientific endeavor, and all the different filaments that had to be tried to use a light bulb. Certainly there have been examples of humans trying lots of different things in order to arrive at one that works. And so, we get to this question of, well, what is it that the human is adding to this research environment? And maybe the answer is, well, deciding which things to go ahead and do and which things not to, which, what to let the AI explore, where to devote the resource to. Certainly the control of resources, I think, is still at this point a distinctly human thing, even though, some humans may decide to delegate that authority to an AI, either within a bounding box or maybe more generally. But you do get into a question of, particularly for a beginning, scientist or beginning investigator that doesn't really have resource, it doesn't really have experience managing resource yet, because they're just trying to learn how to do the science. What is the contribution that they're going to make that allows them to advance to be the person that is entrusted with certain resources and getting to decide where to devote them to and where not to? And again, I don't think we have a great answer for that. There are a lot of different people exploring it in different ways. Certainly a lot of discussions going on about how much and in what areas AI should be used in the scientific endeavor, from some people saying, let's use it everywhere and try to get science moving as quickly as possible, to other people saying, it's okay if it moves a little bit slower, as long as it has these other qualities. In the computational discipline, like where I work, we also have the challenge of industry trying to do stuff for a completely different reason. They're not as concerned with some of the attribution, what some people call the quote unquote academic bean counter aspects of being in an academic institution. They're concerned about getting a result. They have customers that they want to sell something to, or they're hoping to have customers that they want to sell something to. So they're able to go at a different cadence because they have different considerations. But, for those in academia to still be doing valuable work, you have to be going at a cadence that allows you to be contributing beyond what industry already has. So, if you're always 3 steps behind, that's, even if you're able to publish some of that work because nobody else has published it, you're not really contributing to human knowledge so much at that point as you would be if you were, going just a little bit beyond where a particular company has been. And, without going too far down a rabbit hole here, I mean, there are ways of, taking a leap from, an AI provider and saying, hey, I can look at this in a way that the provider may not be interested in. That's kind of a secondary experiment to the primary experiment, but there are a lot of people that do that type of work. But it is a very, very challenging time. And again, kind of brings us back to that question of the role of the human that we've come back to a few times throughout our discussion today.
Yep. I'm interested that you brought up particularly the kind of, I suppose, science side of commercial academic outcomes, really. Do 21st century employers require something different from future employees as compared with universities looking for young academics then?
I think the answer is yes. Whether that's going to persist in the long term, I think there will be factors that may tend to bring those closer together. There may be other factors that may tend to push them further apart. But certainly, with people's time in positions, at least in the United States, I'm not sure. I believe Europe has a similar trend, but I'm not sure if the numbers are about the same. But in the United States, being in a job now for 2 or 3 years is kind of the norm. This is very different from people that went into a career right out of college and then retired from the company, or maybe made 1 or 2 career switches over the terms of their whatever it may be 40 some odd plus year career. Certainly, the academic system is very much designed for that. You start at a position, you gain tenure there, and for many people, they retire from that same kind of first job they took right out of their PhD, or at least the first ranked academic position if they did like a postdoc or something quickly after their PhD. That's not the same as what's going on in industry right now. And one of the implications of that is that a lot of companies don't want to invest a ton in upskilling workers. They don't want to invest a ton in bringing junior employees in and saying, well, we're going to have to train them for 6 months before they can start doing something, because they figure, okay, well, if we bring this person in and we train them for 6 months, are they only going to be here another 6 months or another year? Are we then, training an employee for one of our competitors or for a smaller business that doesn't invest in employees the way some larger firms have historically? That will then that same employee will be turning around and basically competing with them without the new employer having the having the cost of getting them up to speed. And so I think that has made a lot more of an expectation of students, students turned graduates being ready to do stuff much more quickly, being much closer to ready to start contributing productively to the enterprise in a way that some companies maybe didn't expect quite as much of even 5 or 10 years ago, just because of the shorter time in these positions. The other thing that kind of comes into play here, and this is kind of the big conundrum I think for a lot of current students and recent graduates, is that in a lot of areas, particularly those areas that are kind of white collar jobs that have been kind of the mainstay of collegiate graduates for a long period of time, AI is able to do those jobs very effectively. And so you have this kind of double question of, well, the employer doesn't want to invest in an employee that may only be around for however many years, plus they can go pay for an AI to do a lot of that work, and they don't have to upskill it. They know it's never going to quit. And so you get into this kind of double whammy where new graduates, not only do they have to be ready to contribute, immediately or very quickly, much quicker than perhaps was a historical norm, but also they now have to be able to do stuff that an AI doesn't do as effectively, doesn't do as quickly, doesn't do as affordably, or where there's some other aspect of human performance of the task that makes, paying them to do it, as opposed to just putting it into a large language model or other technology, the preferred way to go for the employer. And, not again to go too far down a rabbit hole here again, but the technology is getting better. So, what might be an entry level capability today, could become the mid-level capability before an entry level worker today reached that mid-level point. So the technology may be upskilling, quote unquote, faster than a human employee would be able to. So again, it makes it a very, very challenging time for education when you're trying to figure out, how to get students to a point where they can make that contribution, they can differentiate their contribution from an AI system in that same environment, and trying to see into the future, reading the tea leaves, as you said a few minutes ago, trying to figure out, if we're teaching a student how to do something today, is this skill going to actually be valuable by the time they're in a position to do it? So it's a very, again, a very challenging environment, and I think it's one that we don't have great answers to, and that's what I think, kind of coming back to why are people concerned about this? What creates the concern, and this is by no means unique to this particular industrial revolution, but what creates the concern is that people can't necessarily see beyond this and see how their lives are going to unfold in the way that they were planning, because there's this kind of fogging factor of, well, what's the technology going to do? How is this going to change? And I think that creates a lot of the concern. I think this is what's created the concern in past industrial revolutions as well.
Yeah, it ties in actually with something that Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Charter, said last week. I don't know if this is something that you picked up on over there, describing his back office staff as potentially lower value human capital, people whose work could essentially be replaced by AI at a conference somewhere, I think, in Asia. And then had to subsequently email his employees to say, oh, don't worry, I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about somebody on a different continent. There was that sense that people were looking around and saying, well, am I low value human capital? Could I be instantly replaced by AI? And of course, the real crunch came when it was actually revealed that it would actually cost a fair bit of money to make these people redundant so that the AI could be trained to do their jobs for them. Do we have a sense that business perhaps needs to think a bit more broadly too about what humans are and what they represent, rather than simply what they do?
I mean, I think that's a challenge, and I mean, I think you get to a number of different different factors that kind of come into play here. Certainly, leaders of for-profit companies have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to try to produce, profit in, perhaps the most effective and efficient, ethically, acceptable way possible. Certainly, there are other considerations that go in. Even if you take that very, kind of hard line, well, it's all about the profit approach. Just preventing public backlash may be something that could be justified simply by that, or could justify, not replacing people in that, in that context. I think where we get into a challenge is when, we have individuals that have been doing a role, and that role becomes something that can be automated. And particularly if that individual doesn't want to change to another role or doesn't see an ability to change to the other role, I think that can be very, very tricky. One of the things that an example that I often use that I think is also kind of insightful in this way is these kiosks. I don't know if this is something you see very much in the UK, but in the United States, a lot of our fast food restaurants have started putting in these ordering kiosks. And for the longest time, a lot of people thought that the one thing that was going to be remaining at the fast food restaurants was the ordering aspect. That there are plenty of technologies that automate making food that are used in industrial settings and could be used in fast food restaurants. But I think a lot of people thought that the humans would want to place the order with another human. And it turns out these kiosks are tremendously successful. You're not waiting in line. as long, because you always have four places where a person can place their order, even if they're not four people there, or 5 or 10 or whatever the number of kiosks are in the restaurant. Plus now you can place it on your phone using basically the same thing. And there hasn't been that public backlash of people saying, well, no, I want to go into fast food restaurant X and actually talk to somebody and have that person take my order. And the kiosks, from that perspective, have been successful, but they also do some things that restaurant owners really like. They consistently upsell. Humans have never been very good at upselling in that role, where they offer, would you like this item with that item? In some cases, when humans did the upselling, it was bad, right? I order a sundae. Would you like fries with that? Well, no, I probably don't want fries with my ice cream sundae. That might have been great, add on to a burger. But, if the human's been told that their goal is to sell fries that day, you can offer the fries, whereas the kiosks can be given, a very nuanced plan for what and when to upsell. You can see the food on the kiosks. People really like that. You get your order, at least in terms of the order being taken, with great accuracy. You can kind of review the order on the screen. There's lots of reasons why the customer likes the kiosk as well. And so for people that thought that they were going to be in that role, they would need to figure out what value they can add, both individually and kind of collectively, that the kiosk can't. And, when you move into more upscale restaurants where some of them still have these kiosks, there's a little bit more of the wait staff being involved, because part of the experience is actually having a little bit of a discussion with the customer, asking the customer how they're doing, etc., bringing the food to the customer. So again, I think that this kind of becomes the question as we're moving forward. What exactly is it that humans are bringing to a particular, work role, to a particular environment even, that is something that they do better than the AI, they do more efficiently, they do more effectively than the AI, or something where the customer, the person, that they're interacting with, expects that to be a human, because they don't want to be having a chat about their day with a robot. And maybe people will want to have a chat with their day about the robot. That may be a bad example, but certainly in terms of the metrics, that's the type of stuff I would be thinking about in terms of, trying to answer the question of, well, what is the role of the human kind of going into the future, and what role should we be preparing, students for, again, moving forward?
Well, we're just about out of time, Jeremy, but one final question to ask you is, should we AI-proof some professions and some industries?
So I would say generally no. I guess it depends kind of what you mean by AI proof. But if you're saying, like, should we not allow AI to be used in certain areas? I don't think it makes sense to say, hands down, we're not going to use AI in videography, or we're not going to use AI in education, or we're not going to use AI to be a talk show host, or whatever else it may be. But what we can say is, well, we need to make sure, certainly like in an area like medicine, or in terms of, flying a plane or driving a car, we need to make sure that it's doing it at least as safely as humans, maybe a bit more safely than humans. We need to make sure that there's not going to be, certain types of catastrophic failures where a human may be able to respond to that and adapt to that, that the AI may not have that capability. So I think where it doesn't make sense to necessarily say, there's a line in the sand that's never going to move. It does make sense to say, we need to make sure that we're considering safety. We need to make sure that we're considering societal impact. We need to be, make sure that we're considering other implications of AI use in this area before flipping the switch on. And, like with any technology, I think history has shown that there's always going to be things that, even with the best of plans and the best of intentions, we can't foresee. And, that is, I guess, an unfortunate part of the human condition, or maybe a very fortunate part of the human condition, because it allows us to have excitement and some of the joy that sometimes comes from that, when the unforeseen thing is positive. But, again, moving forward and trying to do it in a safe, reliable, and beneficial way, I think is the modus operandus, I guess, for lack of a better term, of how we should be proceeding with AI use.
Well, I think that's a good place on which to draw our conversation to an end, Jeremy. It's been fascinating talking to you, and I'm very grateful indeed for you sharing your knowledge and ideas with us this evening as we approach what sounds to me like a tipping point in the nature of our understanding of what education is and what it might become, as we begin to delegate an increasing amount of what others might term low-value human labour to the algorithms, large language models, and artificial intelligence tools. It was really fascinating to hear your views on the airline industry, something I wasn't particularly aware of, and the degree to which AI is already part of that regular practice. And it was also interesting to hear how you have started to think about how your students should be prepared for a workplace in which they will need to demonstrate that they can do things that AI can't do, or do things that AI can't do to the standard that the customer expects. So I think that's a very, very pertinent way of thinking about how we value ourselves against the machines that are increasingly moving into the spaces that we occupy. Perhaps this industrial revolution may deliver on the promises that haven't yet been fulfilled by the others, Jeremy. Thank you very much indeed. It's been great to have your company this evening.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Chris.
I hope you enjoy the rest of the academic year and the summer when it comes. So thank you very much indeed.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
And that just about brings us to the end of another Sunday Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio, the home of education conversation. I hope you found this evening's show inspiring and informative, and that you might, if you haven't already done so, find the time to subscribe to our Teachers Talk Radio social media accounts, leave a review of our shows on your preferred podcast provider, or consider getting in touch with a request to appear as one of our guests. If you are a classroom-based teacher or have some other close connection to the teaching profession, then we would love to hear from you. So check out our website at www.ttradio.org and give us the opportunity to put your voice on the air. Thanks again to Dr. Jeremy Straub for tonight's show, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in tonight. Do check out our other Teachers Talk Radio shows this week. We have a number of new hosts continuing to make their debuts, so look up the schedule on the website and give them a listen if you can. This week and every week on Teachers Talk Radio, there is simply so much excellent content to engage with from real teachers working with real students in real schools. You can find anything you've missed of the 2,500 or so shows so far at www.ttradio.org. And if you have something you want to say or to ask others about education anywhere on planet Earth, then perhaps you should consider applying to join the station as a show host. We are always on the lookout for those with current or recent education experience and other less familiar educational settings. Full details can be found on our website. That's all from me for this evening. So thank you for listening, and we will speak again in June. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.